Thank you. Thank you for finding your way here. Great to see you. We don't meet next week. I'll try to remember that. If anyone trickles in toward the end, maybe someone could remind me to announce. I think you know that, but we don't meet next week. It's one of our gathering Sundays, so we will be back 2 weeks out. So that's what's happening, and a future coming to you soon. We are doing a series on the Presbyterian role, particularly and more broadly, kind of the role of the Reformed Christians who were in the colonies in the run-up to the American Revolution. It's been estimated that about 2/3 of the 3 million people who were in the colonies at that time either were or were the direct descendants of Calvinists coming out of the Reformed tradition of the Protestant Reformation. That was pretty well established and taken for granted for many years, but in modern historiography we found that theme to be a little bit neglected. And so I am in the spirit of trying to at least keep a little balance in our estimation of that moment in history, trying to revive something of that understanding. Last week we were looking at the year I'm calling the Year of Two Jonathans, or a Tale of Two Jonathans, 1750. We're about, 25 years ahead of the Revolutionary War now. And of course, the two Jonathans were, on the one hand, Jonathan Mayhew, who was no Calvinist, far, far from it, and had been quite an outspoken critic of the Great Awakening and George Whitefield and that whole movement. He had nothing much good to say about it, and he'd had plenty of criticism of it. But when it began to be persecuted by the official religious authorities, who were mobilizing not only the appeal of preaching, but using political power to try to silence the voices connected with the Great Awakening and this kind of revival that was sweeping through the colonies, even Jonathan Mayhew said, well, now wait a minute. This is overstepping things. Whether I agree with these folks or not, they should have a right to be heard, And so he really begins to see the common enemy and marshaled all of his rhetorical skills against it. And we mentioned last time that the sermon that's sometimes called the Sermon That Changed America was preached in 1750 on the anniversary of the execution of Charles I, which had happened about 100 years earlier. And so while he was ostensibly criticizing Charles I, he was substantially criticizing George II, who happened to be the ruling monarch in England, who was really in many ways part of the driving force behind the attempts to squash the Great Awakening and some of the voices connected with it. It was a very transparent kind of sleight of hand that he did, because he heaped a little praise on George II, first of all, before launching into what everybody recognized was a powerful attack against him. So that John Adams, founding father, 14 years old at the time as he read and reread that sermon, called it, as we mentioned then, his catechism in revolution. He viewed it as what gave him some idea of the legitimacy of an attempt to separate ourselves from England. And so it's an interesting moment. Now, the other Jonathan that we, of course, mentioned was Jonathan Edwards. As I thought about them, it doesn't quite fit, but it reminds me of the biblical statement, he must increase and I must decrease. Well, Jonathan Edwards certainly felt like the guy who was decreasing at this point. He got fired from the most prestigious church in New England, the Northampton Congregational Church. And from there, of course, he was plunged into unemployment for a while, wound up, of course, in a rather obscure setting, about 50 to 60 miles down the road, in a community dominated by Native Americans. And the families were wanting someone to come and teach their children the ABCs. And so that's what Edwards did. He became a grammar school teacher and had a ministry there for some years. So that's what we're going to pick up on. I just want to tell you right now, my plan is to cover about 8 years. Breathtaking for me, So we're going to be winding up right about the end of this decade, but I think we can do it. And really the common denominator I'd like to use to tie it together is what happened with Jonathan Edwards. So we'll be treating some other matters, but kind of returning to him along the way, because in some ways I think he becomes a little bit of a signal for us of the direction things are going. And as we do so, the text that I'd like to have you think about is, again, from the book of Philippians, again from the pen of the Apostle Paul, who once again, as we mentioned last week, is there under house arrest in Rome. His freedom of movement has been curtailed. He doesn't seem to be doing as well as he had at other times. And yet he writes these words which have served God's people so well down through history. And I think probably Jonathan Edwards cycled these words through his own mind occasionally as he contemplated his new situation in life there in the little town of Stockbridge. So this is the Apostle Paul, Philippians chapter 4, beginning at verse 11, the Word of God. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I've learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased. I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I've learned to be both full and hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Great counsel for all of us. Let's have a word of prayer as we get started. Father, we're grateful to you for your many mercies to us. We pray that we would be fair to the facts of history and to the truth of your word as we seek to understand these next several years that were so critical in the history of the colonies and in the history of our forebears in the Presbyterian Church and others who were living through these moments. And for all of that, we give you thanks, asking these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, so starting here a little bit with Edwards, he moves to Stockbridge. Now, he remained in Northampton for about a year, unemployed, writing. One of the things he wrote, by the way, was a little piece called Misrepresentations Corrected. He wanted to set the record straight, you know. He wanted to address himself to some of what he thought were distortions of what had taken place in the last couple of years of his service at Northampton, and especially he wanted to defend his critical assessment of the halfway covenant. Now, I've talked about that before, I won't revisit it, but that was really, of course, the stated reason. And he just wanted to explore more deeply why he felt such misgiving about this so-called halfway covenant. And so he addresses it fairly deeply, and part of the reason we understand it as well as we do is because of the writing that he contributed at that point. But a year later, he was offered a job at Stockbridge. As I say, it was a town mostly populated by Native Americans. It was about 60 miles down the road, and he took that. So in 1751, he wound up in that community. Now, the position to be a teacher in Stockbridge had originally been offered to a fellow named Samuel Hopkins. I don't think I've mentioned him before, but I just want to drop his name into the mix at this point. Samuel Hopkins probably became the most powerful voice in the colonies in pre-revolutionary time for what we'd call abolition of slavery. He was a very significant and well-known proponent of the proposition that this was an ungodly, unholy, unchristian kind of institution that should be repudiated. There were many voices that were expressing such an idea, but probably the leader of them, the inspiration for most of them, was Samuel Hopkins. So I just want to have you make a mental note. We'll certainly come back and mention him again. He became an associate of Sarah Wheaton Osborne, who I have mentioned before. The two of them in the same church kind of formed common cause on that particular point, and they together had quite an impact in influencing the colonial situation along the lines of what to do about that institution. So we'll save more comment there. But the point is, he had shown up in Northampton in about 1741, so about 10 years prior to our present concern. He had shown up on the doorstep as a young man at the church of Jonathan Edwards and asked if Jonathan Edwards could take him on, kind of as a helper, an associate, you know. And in fact, he was hired. And so for a while, Samuel Hopkins absorbed the theology and the politics of Jonathan Edwards. And it really was very much inscribed in his, you might say, psychological DNA. And clearly, his later vocal opposition to slavery was produced in large measure through the influence of Edwards in his life. He was there for a few years. Eventually, he became a pastor of a small church of Housatonic Indians, and he pastored there for some years. It was known that he had a deep affection for, that is, Hopkins had a deep affection for Native Americans, and thus the job was initially offered to him. But he said, "No, I think you would do better to offer the job to my unemployed former boss, Jonathan Edwards," which may have seemed in some people's minds like a bit of overkill, to bring one of the greatest geniuses in the world to this particular place of service. But after all, Edwards was unemployed at the time, and so they did extend the offer to Edwards. And in fact, he accepted. Edwards had a long history of loving Native Americans. He had been critical publicly on many occasions of what he viewed as the abuses that had been perpetrated against the natives, mostly by Britain, but certainly by some colonial forces as well. And he wasn't shy about being quite emphatic and incisive in pointing out the abuses that had taken place. And so for that reason, it was known that he was certainly not opposed to a ministry in that setting, and the job was offered to him. And so he went and took that position. He lived in, I'm not going to say radical poverty, but I'm going to say much more impoverished circumstances than he had been accustomed to earlier. This was a tiny little community. They didn't have the wherewithal to pay him much. Most of his payment came, you know how it is, in eggs and squash, that sort of thing. I mean, it was that kind of arrangement. But Edwards, for his part, was cheerful enough and willing enough to see himself in that role, and so he took that position and living in this kind of impoverished situation. The rather interesting, let me make sure I'm... The rather interesting thing about the situation there was that even though he was living in poverty, he produced some of the most amazing works in philosophy and theology of his entire career, because he had a little time on his hands, He would teach the children in the morning. As school was letting out, he had most of his afternoons free, and he devoted himself to writing, to studying, to generating some of the most remarkable works that have ever been produced in American history. Typically, in the afternoons, he would take a little break and go on a horseback ride. And so he would ride off into the lovely surroundings of that particular region, and he'd be gone for maybe an hour or so. And as he was riding around on horseback, he would be thinking about the things that he was writing on and studying, and sometimes ideas would just come to him sort of out of the blue, I suppose this happens to people that are geniuses. I have no experience with this personally. But, just these amazing thoughts would come to him, and he always carried with him a little bundle of what we might call scraps of paper, almost like candy wrappers. He'd carry them along with him. He didn't carry a full tablet, full-size paper, because his poverty was significant enough that he couldn't afford to have paper used in that way. So he would just write on little tiny pieces of paper, and this is Jonathan Edwards' handwriting on a typical piece of that paper. And what would happen is he'd be writing along, and he'd stop thinking, wow, I need to jot that down, and so he'd write it down. Now, if you look at that, if you can see it very well, you'll see that the handwriting is very tiny, much tinier than you might expect. But he did that on purpose to conserve space, because he didn't have a lot of this paper. He didn't want to waste it. But even more than that, and you really can't tell this by looking, he wrote in a code. He had his own kind of shorthand. And so even more to save space, he'd not only write what he was writing in tiny print, but in a kind of abbreviated form that actually helped him be even more efficient in his use of this. He would write these things down, and then to let the ink dry, he would pin them on his garment, using a little straight pen. And so then, as he returned home, His wife, Sarah Pierpont Edwards, said sometimes he came back looking like he'd just ridden through a snowstorm because he had all of these little scraps of paper pinned all over his garments, you know. This is true. And so she would come up and just carefully unpin these, and she took possession of them and put them in safekeeping. Edwards thought eventually he might be able to come back and expand on some of these and so on. And so that was really an interesting little part of what was happening as he was there in Stockbridge. Well, Edwards, of course, as you know, died prematurely. We'll cover that a little bit more later, but he died, and of course that left a lot of unfinished business, including all of these stacks of scraps of paper that Sarah had kept. Eventually, the family donated all of those to Yale, because Yale was the alma mater of Jonathan Edwards, and so she thought, you know, as they were no longer in a position to, you know, be curators for this, that they would give it to the Yale librarian, which they did. And so the Yale Library took under its wings all of these little so-called miscellanies that had been generated by Jonathan Edwards. Well, they were just there in cold storage for many years. But in the mid-20th century, there was a renaissance of interest in the Puritans. I credit mainly Perry Miller. There were others at Harvard, but Perry Miller in particular just discovered, more or less as a shock to him, what a genius these people were, and especially Jonathan Edwards. He wrote a whole volume just on Edwards and his thought and so on, and many other volumes that treated some of these matters. And that sparked a widespread interest at scholarly levels to re-examine the Puritans and to take a look especially at Edwards. And Yale said, you know, we've got all that stuff back in that back room. And they pulled it out, and some scholars began to look at it and realize this was not just a shopping list. This wasn't just, honey, pick up some eggs on the way home. You know, these were profound thoughts, but written in a highly truncated and abbreviated form. And so for about 40 years, Yale University scholars pored over these little scraps of paper, as well as all the other writings of Edwards, and began to produce a set of volumes that eventually was 27 volumes long. I'm talking 27 volumes. The complete works of Jonathan Edwards. This guy was prolific beyond anybody's wildest imaginings. And the thing is, everything he wrote was worth reading by someone. Now, I'm not going to say we should read everything he wrote, but at some level, everybody should read something of what he's written, because he wrote both at a popular level but also at a highly academic and intellectual level, and there's not anybody who could read something of Edwards and not be benefited from it. It reminds me, I've mentioned this before, but in the late 70s I was doing graduate work at Eastern Washington University, and they have a pretty good library of materials from the Puritan era, most of it on microfilm. And so when I was doing my studies, I read a whole lot of Puritan sermons and stuff that was there on microfilm and microfiche and so on in the library. But sometimes I would take a break. And one time I was just kind of wandering through in that particular part of the library, and I saw a set of 15 volumes, and I just noticed the name Edwards. And I walked over, this is probably 78. I walked over 15 volumes. And it says the complete works of Jonathan Edwards. And I thought, I can't believe the guy wrote 15 volumes. And I was only half right. It was 27 volumes, but it was still a work in progress at that point. There were still people grinding it out, painstakingly studying, and I'm going to say translating Edwards' writing into what would eventually become all of these volumes. And so we should really probably appreciate the remarkable contribution that he made. It was finished in the early 2000s, 27 volumes, the complete set. And for just shy of $1,000, you can buy your own set and have it there in your home if you wish. I'm not going to be doing that, friends, but you know, it is there. All right, so that's Edwards for the moment. Shift of venue here. What about our friend Alexander Craighead? Well, we talked about him last week. He uprooted from Pennsylvania, went to Virginia, as you recall, got a pretty cold reception in Virginia, was still looking for a place where he could kind of start from scratch. What he wanted to do was to do a kind of John Knox, clean slate, build a community in a kind of isolated setting that would be Presbyterian, that is John Knox Presbyterian style, both religiously and politically. That's what his vision was, and he just felt like all of the static he was getting in the environment was preventing him from doing that. And so he decided to keep moving. And so he had been there in Virginia, but in 1752 now, he moved to Mecklenburg County, which is, of course, in North Carolina. And he established a Presbyterian outpost there. He had quite a few people with him. They all shared a common vision. And this became one of the most celebrated sub-communities, you might say, in the colonies at the time. This was a very rural area, very rugged, rough. This was not for the faint of heart. These were pioneers of the first order, you know. But their history has been celebrated in some circles ever since. And there's been multiple volumes written describing their particular situation. This one that I'm mentioning here was written by a scholar named Richard Plummer. It's entitled Charlotte and the American Revolution. Charlotte's the main city of Mecklenburg County. If you can't read the subtitle, it says, if I can read it, Reverend Alexander Craighead, the Mecklenburg Declaration and the Foothills Fight for Independence. There's other books. I told you once upon a time that what triggered my interest in this whole thing was another book on the same theme, much more recent, written by Scott Seifert, and I recommend that book if you have interest in pursuing this further. But he covers some of this, but this is one of many that really treated it. The Mecklenburg Declaration, I think you know, was the original American Declaration of Independence. It was written in 1775. It was a declaration by these Presbyterians in Mecklenburg County. It was communicated to the Continental Congress that was meeting at the time in Philadelphia. It was offered to them as a Declaration of Independence that would be extended further than just Mecklenburg County. The people of the Continental Congress looked at it, said, pretty good stuff, but we're still hoping for a peaceful resolution with Britain. Things were definitely heating up by then, of course, but it was still hopeful that there could be some kind of accord that would be reached, and so they felt that it was just a little premature. Nevertheless, that declaration was circulated widely through the colonies, so that it was pretty much known at that time, virtually at every level of the colonial society. It also circulated in England, for that matter. It was well known. And that's why we shouldn't blame Thomas Jefferson for not acknowledging that he borrowed wholesale a fair amount of the language, because he was assuming everybody knew that language and to become part of the sort of the stock and trade, you might say, of the spirit of the colonies at the time. And so what one man called it was a happy plagiarism, and we're not the least bit concerned. I do think it's safe to say, I'll just stick my neck out a little bit here, I don't think Thomas Jefferson, simply informed by the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment especially, would have written those words. But he was reflecting at this point what was not so much his private opinion on things, although he certainly agreed with what he was saying, but it didn't originate in the Enlightenment sources that he was interested in, but he realized how beautifully and articulately there was an expression here of kind of the spirit that was in the air in colonial America, so he borrowed some of that language. We'll look at the language a little more at another time, but just mentioning that in passing. Well, here they were in Mecklenburg County, kind of fearlessly preaching this Scot-Irish Presbyterian, and I love the names. There were two major churches in Mecklenburg County. I'd love to have either of those as the name of my church. I don't mind First Presbyterian, you understand, but listen, how about the Sugar Creek Presbyterian Church? Isn't that great? Or how about the Rocky River Presbyterian Church? You know, these were very descriptive terms, and these people were describing, of course, their places of worship, and they really were kind of establishing a sort of insular community there, but was really, at least for a time, a pretty faithful replication of something John Knox himself would have endorsed. The man who was more or less in control of that region, this was really undeveloped, but he had some kind of legal oversight of it, was a fellow by the name of Arthur Dobbs. In 1755, he wrote a letter to the Board of Trade of Great Britain describing this community in these words. He says, "There are at present 75 families on my lands," meaning this land that he had oversight of. "They are a colony from Ireland, removed from Pennsylvania, or what we call Scot-Irish Presbyterians, who with others in the neighboring tracts had settled together in order to have a teacher of their own opinion and choice." Arthur Dobbs, of course, not one of them, but kind of observing from a distance, not condemning or condoning necessarily, but just kind of acknowledging that these people were there and had that particular sort of reputation and so on. Scott Seifert, who I've mentioned before, said, quote, "Rivers and creeks made travel difficult, but provided ample drinking water and defined a region that the settlers called Mesopotamia, because set off by two major rivers. The area was open to settlement in 1749, the original settlers. These fellows showed up in 1752, Craighead. By 1758, hundreds of land grants had been issued to the surviving settlers. All right, so now we've got Edwards in play over in Stockbridge. We've got Alexander Craighead down in Mecklenburg County. Right in the middle between them, the College of New Jersey. So I've mentioned this before as well. You know that it was originally the log college established by William Tennant. Very sort of out there on the edges, not recognized as a legitimate official college or anything of the sort. But in 1746, we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, it was actually chartered. Now what that means is it gained official state recognition as a college that was regarded as a legitimate academic institution. So it was kind of a big deal. The problem was that they still were just living on a shoestring. The log college had virtually no financial resources to speak of, and the College of New Jersey now, as it was called, wasn't much better off. So Gilbert Tennant, who is the son of William Tennant, decided to go on a 2-year fundraising trip in England. Now, the reason he was going to England was because, as you probably know, along with the Great Awakening in the colonies, there was a concurrent Great Awakening in England. Largely the work of John Wesley, Charles Wesley, but then many others in that so-called rising Methodist movement in England were preaching in the spirit of a Great Awakening there, very much as George Whitefield was in the colonies. Of course, Whitefield preached in both venues during his career. So it was understood that in England there might be some very receptive pocketbooks, to a fundraising appeal. And so he went over to appeal to these people in that setting. I might mention, by the way, that even as slavery was something that was treated in the Great Awakening in the colonies, even more so in England, John Wesley, his followers, and others who came later, John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace, William Wilberforce, the Member of Parliament, and others, continued to be more and more vocal in condemning slave trade that was conducted by the British shipping industry. No slaves in England, but they were shipping them all over the world, of course, and it was bringing in a whole lot of what John Wesley called dirty money, into England, making a lot of people very rich, but at what cost? He continued to beat that drum more and more vigorously. He wrote a little tract that was called Thoughts on Slavery that was just amazingly harsh in condemning what the English were doing. It cut to the soul, you might say, of the English conscience. Eventually, it all culminated in what's called the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which officially outlawed British shipping having anything to do with slave trade. From that point on, if you were going to be doing slave trade, you were committing a crime for which you could be imprisoned or worse. And so that was a big turning point, a big victory, you might say, in England. based on the influence of John Wesley. Well, it didn't quite happen that way in the colonies, of course, but we had a similar protest among those connected to the Great Awakening on that point. So anyway, the point is here, Gilbert Tennant went over, preached to these people, and was doing this kind of fundraising for a couple of years. He preached in England, he preached in Scotland, he preached in Ireland. He was emphasizing in all of these places that the New Light Presbyterians who were supporting the College of New Jersey were your kin, your brothers, and you should be supporting them. And in fact, he had a fair amount of success in those efforts. I'll just throw in for free here, I don't think even Gilbert Tennant quite appreciated just how successful the College of New Jersey would be, or how influential it would be in the coming years connected to the Revolution. This is from J.D. Dickey again, who is commenting on the history of the College of New Jersey, saying the college had its roots in a small but controversial wooden structure in Neshaminy, Pennsylvania, the original log college of William Tennant. We've covered that. In its first 20 years, the school graduated 97 highly articulate and unusually vocal Presbyterian ministers who preached both spiritual and political messages. 94 would take arms against the British, and more than 100 would serve in political office in the new republic, with 5 members of the Constitutional Convention. This was the first major dissenting college in America, a bulwark of nonconformity against the Church of England and a breeding ground for future revolutionaries. Part of the reason we can talk about Presbyterians in the American Revolution, because that particular college was pumping out revolutionary spirits, within this setting that were really highly effective and very influential. The president, of the College of New Jersey, eventually Princeton, was John Witherspoon, immigrating from Scotland, founding father, signed the Declaration of Independence, and left his imprint on a lot of these folks, James Madison among them, and other names you'd recognize that went through this school and were deeply influenced by the education that they received there. Next year, I'm calling this Mayhew's Fire, Franklin's Peace. I've mentioned him before. We won't say more about it except to remind you that he is, in some ways at this point, maybe the most well-known voice for what would be called at least pre-revolutionary preaching. He would preach sermons that had named by name royal officials and mentioned the abuses that he thought they were responsible for. He said, for them, loyalty and slavery mean the same thing. They're calling you to be loyal. What they really mean is they're calling you to be slaves. That's the kind of rhetoric he used. To prepare us for a dutiful reception of an hereditary tyrant, an Anglican bishop, or worse, that would simply strong-arm conformity here in the colonies. But now Mayhew has to turn his attention to another front. The French and Indian War is looming on the horizon. The French and Indian War is going to be an attack basically from the west. And so now, while Mayhew continues to aim his criticism against the British and their influence through the Anglicans, he's also turning his guns against the French and their Catholic religion. And he gives about equal time for a while to both sides. You see, here he's in the middle, kind of shooting in both directions. Now, I'm going to give, I don't think anyone in the room is a practicing Catholic, but somebody someday is going to hear this lecture who is a Catholic, I'm sure. And so I'm going to give my apologies right up front. I'm just the messenger. But I thought you might be interested in some of the rhetoric that made it into Mayhew's sermonizing when it came to the French. So just for what it's worth, just for fun, this is what he said. This is Jonathan Mayhew now, quote from one of his sermons. Quote, "Do I see Christianity banished for popery, the Bible for the mass book, the oracles of truth for fabulous legends? Do I see liberty, property, religion, happiness changed, or rather transubstantiated, into slavery, poverty, superstition, wretchedness, oh dishonest, profane, inexorable sight, oh piercing sound that entereth into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth? Where, in what region, and what world am I? Is this imagination its own busy tormentor? Or is it something more divine? I will not, I cannot believe 'tis prophetic vision, or that God has so far abandoned us. You know, you listen to this guy, and for whatever else, it was very entertaining, but he did kind of rouse a certain degree of ire, and now the ire was going in two directions. We had the British over here, and of course the French coming in the other direction. Franklin, for his part, ever the diplomat, was trying to find a peaceful resolution of the problem. Ben Franklin, of course, was a master of negotiation, and he was at this point still hoping to avoid a bloodbath. Everybody understood the threat that was mounted by the French and Indian War that was looming, that would be off to the west. And so there was a gathering called the Albany Convention. And the Albany Convention had representatives from all 13 colonies. And the plan was to try to develop a joint defense arrangement in which the colonies, for the first time, would really unite politically against the threat that was mounting, or at least on the horizon, from the what came to be called the French and Indian War. So the Albany Convention, this, by the way, is from a standard history textbook. It's just kind of a plain vanilla description of what happened. The Albany Convention, which met in 1754 to prepare for the French and Indian War, adopted a plan of union presented by Franklin, a plan of union among the 13 colonies. So that's the union there, providing for a president general appointed and supported by the crown. All right, so here's Franklin's brainchild. Let's unite all 13 colonies politically and put them under a president. But the president is not going to be elected popularly. The president will be appointed by the King of England. And that's going to maintain peace, of course, with England. But then he added a grand council of delegates elected triennially by the colonies according to population. So he had in addition an idea of kind of a parliament in which the representatives would come based on, numerical pro rata population of the various colonies, and they would have considerable influence, so they could actually overrule, if necessary, the president, kind of a veto power, you might say, and so on. So they'd be empowered within limits to lay taxes and make laws for common interest, especially to fight this conflict from the French. Franklin believed that the adopting of this scheme would have postponed the revolution for a century. Franklin thought this is kind of a compromised position. He believed eventually there must be separation. Maybe there even needed to be a war. But he thought this would kick the can down the road quite a ways if this Albany Agreement could be put into effect. But as it gave so much power to the King of England, it was rejected by the people in every colony. That does kind of tell you the temperature of the colonial population. Nobody was willing to allow a president to be appointed by the King of England. That's how hostile they had generally become to the influence of the King of England. All right, the French and Indian War. I know you all know this because you all studied this, didn't you, in high school, American history, and you have this right on the. But just in case it's a distant memory, let me just give you a really, really quick sketch of what happened. I don't know if my little pointer is going to. Can I? I don't even see it up there. Do you see it? Oh, there it is. Okay. You see my little red dot? Okay, so there is France. It was called New France. The French basically had a control up in Canada, but it did reach down this light kind of beige color or tan color, whatever it is, down into this region, which is off to the west of the northern and middle colonies. So you see that all the way down here. Here's the colonies in kind of the dark tan. The disputed area is right in the middle. So the whole conflict all the way down was between the French, who had gathered some Native American tribes to join them in this conflict against the British colonies, which gathered some, Native American tribes to join them. So it was called the French and Indian War because the Indian population took a significant role in it. And the disputed area was right here. These would be all area, generally east of the Mississippi. That was the disputed part. So the problem the colonies had was that if the French won that territory, then obviously they were right on our doorstep, and the threat became a much more significant. Right now there's kind of a buffer that made them feel a little safer, but that could be forfeited, and so there was a fair amount of concern about what would happen. Well, to make a long story really quite short, the French were finally defeated. There was a series of battles, and essentially the result was that the colonies picked up that real estate rather than the French. Gained considerable territory. This was basically undeveloped territory that came as a result of the conflict that was taking place there. That was probably generally good news for the colonies, but the trauma of the experience was brutal for the colonists. Jonathan Edwards himself and many others were treated to the most abusive treatment by British soldiers who just basically came in, took over the house. Edwards himself was booted out of his own house. Soldiers were sleeping in his bed, eating his food, and he was basically shoved out to the lower 40 kind of thing, and that was a very common experience. There was a whole lot of bitterness that was engendered by the treatment of the colonists during the French and Indian War because of the just kind of roughshod treatment that was handed out by the British at that point. It's rather astonishing if you read Edwards' own journals of what he was going through here, that he constantly gives praise to God. It is a remarkable thing that he sets a standard, really, of saying, I know how to abound, I know how to be abased. And in many ways, this was probably one of the most gruesome experiences of being abased that any of us could imagine. And yet, at least as reflected in his writings and so on, it doesn't seem that he allowed any sort of spirit of bitterness to shuffle in, but it was certainly a rough time for him. It was interesting that in the very middle of this tumultuous time, Edwards received a gold embossed invitation from the College of New Jersey. Gilbert had returned from England. He'd been much more successful than he had ever hoped and had now a sufficient kind of capital base to really make some significant improvements, including hiring a true president of this institution. And so the offer was made to Jonathan Edwards to become the president of what had once been the Log College and was now going to be the College of New Jersey and would eventually be Princeton University. And Edwards declined it initially. And his reason in a letter he wrote back was he wasn't worthy of the office. He thought it was above his pay grade to take the position of a college president. It makes us roll our eyes a little bit, but I think he was sincere. He was one of the most humble men to be such a genius that we could possibly hope to meet. But with a great deal of pressure from the board of directors of the College of New Jersey, he eventually tearfully accepted the role, and over the next year or so closed things down, his service there in Stockbridge, and moved with his family there to the College of New Jersey and the presidency of that place, and actually was able to take over for a brief time. Gilbert Tennant, for his part, returned from this fundraising campaign literally with 10 times more than he had hoped to gather even in his wildest imaginations. He was successful beyond anything he could have imagined. And so it really was a huge step forward for the college as a result of that. All right, the next little section I'm finishing up with this. I'm calling it The Blurring of the Lines, 1756 to 1759. Okay, now, do you see that little banner at the bottom? It says Presbyterians in the American Revolution. I had really mixed feelings when I saw that. Because to be honest with you, I thought the title, Presbyterians in the American Revolution, was my innovation of genius. You know? I thought, hundreds of years from now, people are going to remember that phrase. It's going to be famous. And then I find out somebody was already there and got the title ahead of me. And they even had a nice banner put up for it. And somebody somewhere, some church, did a whole series, probably much better than the one you're being treated to, called Presbyterians and the American Revolution. I haven't been able to find that series yet, but I think it's out there somewhere. So I just came across this poking around in the internet, and I thought, well, okay, there you go. I didn't innovate anything. This was already there. But what happens in these years? This is during the French and Indian War, and the evident threat that's coming by virtue both of British abuses and the French threat was that at this point you probably would say religion and politics became fully fused. It had been triggered by the Great Awakening, but these people had taken their faith to the street, as we've tried to document on other occasions. It was aggravated by laws that were passed and political pressure that was applied to try to silence these people. And the net result of it was that they began to demand liberty in their faith. And the demand for liberty, of course, was taking on fully political character. There was a cross-section of voices. You have Andrew Croswell on the one hand, who is a straight out of the Great Awakening. He is a great supporter of George Whitefield. He loves Jonathan Edwards. He's a card-carrying Calvinist. And he is preaching here in Boston a message that expresses the spirit of the Great Awakening, but also has a huge amount of political overtone to it. So if you heard his sermons, you would hear him fiercely attacking the institution of slavery. He attacked public whippings. Corporal punishment was not uncommon in the colonies at that time. He attacked what he thought was overly rigid rule of keeping women silent in the church. He thought that was a misunderstanding of two texts in the New Testament from the Apostle Paul, in which Paul is accommodating himself to the life of the synagogue at the time, but not contemplating an abiding rule that would stand for thousands of years into the future. Now that's a debated point. I'm not going to get into it, but the point is that this man was saying we're misreading Paul there. We're reading too much into his instructions, and he really did want to give a lot of freedom and opportunity for ministry to women, but he especially was attacking Jonathan Mayhew and his liberalism, you see. And yet, oddly enough, when it came to Mayhew and Andrew Croswell, they virtually sounded identical, like twin brothers, when it came to their political vision of the colonies. This is what's kind of amazing, is that now there's a united voice sparked originally in the Great Awakening, but now really coming from all quarters at this time. Croswell attacked Mayhew with ferocity for his theology, but it is interesting they shared a great deal in common when it came to their politics. Both Croswell and Mayhew maintained powerful sermonic campaigns against British authority and the abuses of the Anglican Church. Well, there's a changing of the guard. Our good friend Jonathan Edwards died in 1758. Smallpox was going around. All of his family took the same vaccine, you know. It wasn't a vaccine mandate, friends, but it was a vaccine that people thought was judicious, and so everybody took it, including Jonathan Edwards himself. But for some reason, he got a live sample and got ravaging smallpox as a result of the vaccination, and died after maybe 2 or 3 months. Painful, of course, as you can imagine. The universal testimony was that to the very end he was a man who was rejoicing, and I accepted this as God's providential care for him. And so it's a remarkable career, one of the most amazing careers we could think about in terms of the history of the colonies. Even though he was gone, his writing, of course, continued to give a considerable intellectual foundation for the upheavals that would come in the future. And if we had time, a separate lecture, it'd be fun just to trace all of the descendants of Jonathan Edwards and all of the things they've done. There are Edwards descendants to this day in the United States, and there have been all kinds of college presidents and scholars and others, political leaders and so on, who could trace their history back to that marriage and the 12 kids or so that he produced. So anyway, it's a fascinating story, but we'll leave it there for the time being. Well, in this particular year, 1758, the Presbyterians, I'm happy to report to you, reunited. They had split between New Side, Old Side, remember, 17 years earlier, and now, 17 years later, they reunite. But now, the winners, you might say, if I can put it in those terms, would be the New Siders. That they have come to fully dominate the Presbyterian Church, and the Presbyterian Church has been recreated as a result of what's been happening through the ministry of people like Gilbert Tennant and others. And so it really does make the Presbyterian Church then a much more powerful institution because they shared one common vision. William Tennant died in 1746, but his College of New Jersey did not lose its influence after it led to a New Side victory. It also played a prominent role in the actual Revolutionary War that was to come. I want to wrap up giving you a quote from John Adams. I mentioned to you last week that the sermon that had been preached by Jonathan Mayhew, he called his Catechism and Revolution. This is now a few years later. John Adams would be in his early 20s. He's just begun to be a practitioner of law. He's gone through a kind of apprenticeship. That was the common way that a person became a lawyer in those days. He was a diligent student of the Scriptures, but that doesn't make him unique because everybody was a diligent student of the Scriptures. Thomas Paine, who was basically an agnostic at best, was a diligent student of the Scriptures. Not everybody agreed with them, but everybody knew them. It was the parlance of the day. It was the vocabulary, the phrases, the allusions, and so on were just so much a part of what a reasonably educated person would be familiar with that everybody was expected to know the Bible well. But John Adams, as he studied it, seemed to have had a much more deep appreciation for what he was saying. This is taken from his journal. So this is a journal entry of John Adams when he's roughly 22, 23 years old, and he writes this concerning his reflection on what he reads in the Bible. He says, suppose a nation in some distant region should take the Bible for its only law book, and every member should regulate his conduct by the precepts there exhibited. Every member would be obliged in conscience to temperance and frugality and industry, to justice and kindness and charity toward his fellow men, and to piety, love, and reverence toward Almighty God. In this commonwealth, no man would impair his health by gluttony, drunkenness, or lust. No man would sacrifice his most precious time to cards or any other trifling and mean amusement. No man would steal or lie or in any way defraud his neighbor, but would live in peace and goodwill with all men. No man would blaspheme his Maker or profane his worship, but a rational and manly, a sincere and unaffected piety and devotion would reign in all hearts. What a utopia. What a paradise this region would be. It's rather remarkable, isn't it? From John Adams, founding father, writing when he's about 22 years old. I don't think that conviction ever left him. He obviously became a politician, and he's controversial in some people's minds, and we had a lot of interesting personalities, but I think that being impressed with the biblical testimony was always part of his outlook. All right, just wrap things up. Sunday school lesson, I know how to abound, I know how to be abased, I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. That's my Sunday school lesson for you. Let me expand it just briefly. At times, God is pleased to put his people in a position of abounding. And they are then tested to avoid pride, greed, or an attitude of disdain toward those who are more poorly situated. We have people in our culture today who are fabulously, almost incalculably wealthy. And I'm going to tell you a little secret. Just keep it between us. When people are very, very wealthy, they tend to view the rest of us with a little bit of contempt and think they are smarter than we are and have a right to tell us what we should think. Are you aware of that? There are voices out there that are trying to tell you what you should think or hear, and that other things you shouldn't be exposed to. Well, that's the temptation of wealth. Paul writes to Timothy and says, "Warn those who are rich in this world not to put their hopes in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who generously provides us everything we need for our enjoyment." He says in the same context, people who want to get rich, that becomes their passion, stab themselves with all kinds of horrible kind of self-inflicted wounds. That's the net effect of it there. There's truth to it, isn't it? I'm so glad I'm not wealthy, you know. I mean, I'm not poverty-stricken, but I just think God has given me exactly to the penny what I need, you know, so that to avoid that. Now, I don't know that I do avoid it, but at least I'm grateful that I think that's what God has done for all of us. On the other hand, at times God is pleased to put his people in positions of abasement. And they are then tested to avoid resentment, worry, or an attitude of envy toward those who are more comfortably situated. You know, bad attitudes are ubiquitous. No matter what your situation is in life, it's perfectly possible to have a really bad attitude about it. And those who are maybe less well provided for, at least as it seems, also have their own sort of reasons to be on their guard. Finally, for all of us at all times, God is pleased to put his people in a position of contentment. And they are always called to embrace the promise that he causes all things to work together for good in their lives. We're called to be content. The New Testament never condemns being wealthy. If you're wealthy, God bless you. You know, it's wonderful. The warning in the New Testament is not to rely on your wealth or to use it as a method of doing things that are less than godly. Wealth is a wonderful privilege, but whether it's there or not should have no bearing whatsoever on the state of our faith. Our faith is a very different kind of thing, and the call for all of us, wealthy or not, is of course a life of contentment. Amen. I'm done. I'm 1 minute early. And I would love a question or two, if there's anybody that... Yeah. Robbie's question is, England did not have slavery internally. In other words, there were not, now there may have been on the side, there may have been, you know, I'm just saying as an official policy, slaves did not exist in England. They did have a slave class in a sense, in especially the industrial towns, the Industrial Revolution. The mills, the mines, the factories, you know, these had a class of people working there, and if you looked at them, you'd say they were slaves. They were paid just a pittance, often in horrible working conditions. Children working in mines, you know. So you look at it and say, well, you know, arose by any other name. So I don't want to be too, I don't want to paint this too positively. But there was a rule that you wouldn't have slaves in England. But slave trading was permitted, but English shipping was basically outside of England, shipping them all over the world otherwise. I hope that gets at your questions then. Yeah. Eric Metaxas, is that right with an M? Yeah. And the name of the book is Seven Men. Yeah, Seven Men. So Mitch.
He's got another 7 more men.
Okay, good. Yeah. Yeah. He's a great writer. Some of his books are children's books and so on. So the book Mitch is recommending, and I'm sure Mitch's judgment is very good here, that this book by Eric Metaxas, 7 Men is the title of it. So thank you for that. All right. Well, thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. We don't meet next week. Remember, 2 weeks out, we'll be back and pick up there. So let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Father, we're grateful that you have used people in history like Jonathan Edwards, people who rise above most of the rest of us to give great light, great insight. We thank you that we can live in the contributions they've made, but we thank you that you've called each of us to our own particular task, and whether we are great intellectuals like him or just plodding along like most of us do, that you've nevertheless called us to our own unique, distinct contribution, possible by your grace, enlightened by the vision you give us, and for that we are grateful and pray that we'd be faithful to whatever call you've placed on our lives. All of that in the name of Christ.